Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and this video is called Medieval Renaissance Orbs and Aspects Out of Sight, Out of Mind, question mark. It's going to be a short video. We're going to talk about aspects. In particular, I want to say something about orbs. And, obviously we're going to be getting into medieval Renaissance astrological technique. Going to be some comparison with modern. Again, the key thing to keep in mind is that these are just different approaches, different schools. One of the key unconscious assumptions that people make is that there's a right way and a wrong way. The right way is good. It's going to be, come up with perfect results every time. The wrong way is bad. It's wrong. It's going to have bad results, and in fact, it's going to have very dire consequences. And this is kind of floating under the surface here every time we come across these, when in fact, we're basically talking about the difference between English writing, with an English saddle, or Western writing with a Western saddle. Neither one's wrong. It's really what your preference is and really what fits your circumstances better. So let's just dive right into aspects. The aspect comes from the Latin aspectus, to see. So medieval Renaissance astrology, only the planets see, only the planets make aspects. Okay, the planets are the active ones. They're the ones out there doing something in terms of making the aspect. So in terms of seeing, they can see at a certain distance. So if they're a certain distance apart in zodiacal longitude, they're separate from something, the planet can see it at a certain distance away. And in medieval Renaissance, we're doing aspects by degree. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So 60 degrees apart is a sextile. That's positive, but not the most positive. 90 degrees apart is a square, negative, but not the most negative. 120 degrees apart is a trine, most positive aspect. And then 180 degrees apart is an opposition, which is the most negative aspect. A conjunction in medieval Renaissance astrology is technically not an aspect. There you have an influence not by seeing, but by presence. You're close enough to it, you're conjoined with it, that you have an influence over it. So what this means is that all sorts of non-planetary celestial factors can exert influence by being near something by presence. So for the most part, a conjunction is treated as an aspect, but again, technically it's not, and it matters in terms of the fact that, like I said, you can have, for example, the south node. You can be conjunct the south node or have the south node in a house, and that's going to affect that first house, or it could affect something, a non-planet in that house. So, but again, it's not making an aspect because that its influence is not by seeing, it's not by being distant, but by being close to it, by its close presence. So again, typically in modern, there's a simplification process. When we look at the origin of medieval Renaissance astrology and the Arabic astrology of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, super complex. There's a certain amount of simplification to medieval, which is still very similar, basically the same school, and then to Renaissance. It's a little more simplified, again, still basically the same school. But by the time we jump up to modern, it's really simplified. It's much more, it's something you can pick up very quickly. And there's loss of a lot of nuance, so that you have a lot, it's easier to learn, right? But then there's a loss of a lot of the complexity and the ability to give information. Again, not bad, it's just, you can see the process underway, has its advantages and disadvantages. When we look at aspects, the use originally in Hellenistic astrology for aspects, they're used, again, to show contact. And that's ultimately what an aspect is when you have a planet aspecting something, the planet is in contact with that other factor, whether it's a planet or some other kind of celestial factor. Aspects show contact. And then the quality of that aspect, like I said, whether it's benefic or malefic, sextile trine, square opposition, shows the quality of the contact, shows the quality of the interaction. And as opposed to strength, which is shown by essential dignity, and also to a certain extent by accidental dignity. So in Hellenistic astrology, as I was saying, the aspects are sign to sign. We're not using degrees. It's just if they were anywhere in one sign that's anywhere in the other sign, say 2 signs away would be considered to be in sextile. 3 signs away would be a square, 4 signs away a trine, and 6 signs away would be in an opposition. So anywhere in the entire sign is in that, having that aspect, having that contact. Again, not better, not worse, simply a different method. There's this change that starts to come in from sign to sign aspects to aspects by degree. Again, if you look at that Arabic early medieval astrology, they're using sign to sign aspects for some purposes, and they're using aspects by degree for other purposes. So you have this kind of this mixed changeover. So when you start talking about aspects by degree, however, then orbs start to come into play. Okay, so what an orb is basically this zone of influence before and after the perfection of the aspect. So when, as I said, a sextile is 60 degrees, when the aspect is perfected when it's exactly 6 degrees apart between the planet and whatever it's aspecting. Now, before 60 degrees, like I said, if it's 54 degrees apart, so 6 degrees from perfection, it's still going to be exerting some influence. And again, this is a key, it's used in modern astrology as well as medieval Renaissance. You have these orbs. And for modern astrology, essentially there's a set orb for the aspect. It's the aspect that has the orb, and it has an effective distance in degrees. In medieval Renaissance, it's typically, as is typical with medieval Renaissance astrology, it's more complicated. So the planets have an orb, and then you take half the planet's orb and call it a moiety. So if two planets are aspecting each other, you add their moieties together. Sort of complicated. William Lilly, who's a very famous Renaissance Hori astrologer, in his 1642 Christian Astrology, on page 107, he has an orb table. So each planet, he lists two different orbs, and he's sort of like, well, some people say this, but other people say this one, and most people say this, but some people say that. So he goes back and forth between these two orb numbers. And then he says, and they're often really different. There could be a huge difference between the orbs for these that Lilly gives. And he says, sometimes I use one and then the other as my memory best remember them. He also is saying it depends on my experience. So you've got this much more variable, and confusing. And so, modern astrologers and then my students are always naturally asking, what's the exact orb? Because they're assuming that there must be an exact number, and they're assuming that there must be one number, and there must be one that's objectively right. So this is kind of like, well, if you say, well, it kind of depends, that puts people in a real tizzy. But it reminds me of the situation like, a master chef, and he says, well, you want to use a hunk of butter. And they say, well, how much is a hunk of butter? And they say, well, it depends, and you can tell intuitively. And this is one of those things of like the exact perfect number, the sort of false precision of a lot of modern scientific approach. The 11.7 people were very happy. It's like it's really not. It's giving you this. It's really not giving you the. It looks precise, but in fact, it's really not a precise answer. When you're dealing with medieval Renaissance astrology, it's very much this reality again that people are not really used to. Is that we have a combination of technique, but with the intuition and judgment and experience of the astrologer. So, in order for you to actively get your intuition going to be able to do accurate predictions, you're going to have to find a congenial technique. And there's a variety of different possibilities that can be chosen out of the medieval Renaissance or whatever school you're working in, and to help engage that. And this idea that there's one perfect technique that works independently of the astrologer that works the same for everybody, again, is really a myth. It doesn't work that way, at least in my experience. And a lot of this concern about the exact number is a lot of fear. If you get it wrong, there'll be major problems. You get it, you're not going to get an accurate answer. Like I said, terrible stuff's going to happen. The reason, though, that we have this complexity in medieval Renaissance is because we're modeling reality, and reality itself is very complicated. So again, you've got this sort of loosey-goosey, intuitive variation that's going on in the medieval Renaissance orb stuff. And that's certainly the approach I take. It's very heavily contextual. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at the situation, and I'm going to have variation. I'm going to essentially say, not have the strict cutoff that you have in the modern. The modern approach to orbs is essentially taking them as a cliff. Okay, so if your orb is 8 degrees, then the aspect is totally effective up to 7 degrees and 59 minutes, and then it's totally ineffective at 8 degrees and 1 minute. You've fallen off the cliff. It's not even effective anymore. What I'm using is a different, again, alternative approach. I like it, but it doesn't mean it's objectively better, which is to look at the orbs as slowly increasing their influence the closer you get to perfection. So rather than having this abrupt boundary, having this cliff, you basically have this gently sloping hill. And that sort of makes sense if you think about it, if you thought about it sort of an energy field. Again, I'm not a big energy fan, but if you thought about it that way, the energy is coming off and it slowly is increasing as you get closer, slowly getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger to perfection. And again, that's going to make a difference in your delineation. Rather than just saying these two planets or this planet is connected to a particular factor and it's undifferentiated, the distance is going to give you a sense of the strength of that interaction. It also can give you timing indications in terms of how many degrees they are away, or at least in a sense of like it's short term, long, medium term, and long term. Something's less than a degree from perfection and an applying aspect, something that could be happening very quickly, it could be happening imminently. Or it could be, again, it's a very strong aspect, it's very close. A square or opposition, it's very close to perfection, that's a very strong negative influence, as opposed to one that's really out at the edge of the orb. Then you're going to say, well, it's in place, but there's a negative influence, but it's not so strong. So you can see there really is a difference in terms of just like on-off, right? The distance is giving you increasing amounts of nuance, increasing amounts of information, and it feeds into your overall looking at the patterning of the chart. Because essentially that's what you're trying to do. Not list a bunch of individual factors and they have the information, but look at how the factors are interact together and synthesize and get your underlying sense of the patterning of the chart's reflecting. So another thing that I would say about the whole, again, the modern approach with the aspects like a cliff, so it's on-off, is this heuristic of out of sight, out of mind. And if you think about it like a movie or television show or whatever, everything you see in that is important. If they have a shot of an axe on the wall, you can be sure that that axe is going to come up in the plot later. Nothing's unimportant. Everything's meaningful. And everything's important. Everything that happens is important. Reality just isn't like that, though. Reality is full of irrelevant detail. There's this huge amount of stuff that's coming at you, and you have to sort through and figure out the significance of it. And so, again, that's sort of my approach to orbs. The way modern orbs are, they set the orb so that if it's set at 8, if at 8 degrees in 1 minute, you can't even see it. It's disappeared. Since the orb's not in effect, it's out of sight, out of mind, doesn't matter, we're not going to pay any attention to it. What I tend to do is to set these extremely wide orbs on my software so I can see the aspect, even if I'm going to treat it as being out of orb. I want to be able to see the aspect. I want to be able to make the decision for myself based on the context. And this can get confusing for people because my students will look at a chart and they'll say, oh, look, there it is. I can see the square. Yeah, but it's like 13 degrees. And they're sort of like, well, why am I seeing it if it's not important? Because you need to exercise your judgment. We don't want the software deciding for you. We don't want to overly simplify. We want to see the detail there so we can look at it and pick out from all the information in the chart what's actually significant. Same thing with talismans. People get worried about stuff. I mean, the classic one is that people look at a chart, for a sun talisman, and the sun is separating from an opposition, and they're not seeing that there's a difference. I'm going to talk a little about that later. They don't see that, or they don't see that it's out of orb. So I get people very upset, emailing me, freaked out, and I have to tell them, no, it's not a problem because of the way I have a different methodology of how I'm looking at that chart. I'm not eliminating all the factors that are negative, if it's, out of orb or whatever. I'm going to see that and then make a judgment as far as whether the relevance of it is or not. So again, like I said, what I'm trying to do is to see these deeper underlying patterns, to not apply these strict rules in every single case. But again, context is king. Something that might be problematic in one context, I'd say it's a little close. I mean, what I'll typically do with aspects, a student will send me an election for a talisman, and I can say, there's the sun is applying to square, Saturn or something. It's a sun talisman. And so the aspect is, say, 8 degrees. At that point, I'm going to say, look, it's not optimal. It's usable in a pinch, but really you'd like to avoid that. On the other hand, if they have it's applying to, like I said, 12 degrees away, I'm going to say, look, you don't even need to worry about it. 7, 6, I'm like, that's too close. So, as you can see, there's a certain judgment that goes along with it. And again, it depends on the circumstances. If you absolutely have to do this as the only one the whole year, maybe you're just going to have to put up with that. Maybe there's some other, positive things about it that help a little bit. But it gets to a certain point where we say, you know what? Like I said, I'm probably around that 7 to 8 to 7. I'm going to start saying, you know what? I'm getting nervous about that. But But again, I'm trying not to do it as a strict rule. I'm trying to look at it in context. At the same time, I don't want to be like wishing everything away. So, oh, there's a tendency in modern astrology to have some negative aspect or negative problem with the chart and then come in and just wish it out of existence. Oh, it's Kazemi, so that makes up for the fact that the sun is in detriment, and Mercury retrograde is applying to it. But there's a Kazemi in there. I don't do Hail Marys, I don't do saves, and I don't erase negative factors. But I do want to be looking at stuff in context. So one of the other things that comes along with just the switch from sign to sign aspects versus degree orbs is this applying and separating. And so when you've got sign to sign, it's just an aspect, and you don't have a differentiation between applying and separating. That's only possible when you have degree orbs. So when you're coming up to it and then you pass it. The perfection of it that's the set, this, like I said, sextile 60 degrees. If you're 63 degrees, then you're separating. If you're 54, you're applying. In natal astrology, whether you're talking about modern astrology or medieval Renaissance, there really isn't a huge difference between applying and separating. Again, we're kind of still sticking with that if it's an aspect. And so it's showing that contact. If you've got, for example, in your natal chart, you have the first ruler, applying to, trying the second ruler, that's showing a connection between the first house and the second house. Second house is wealth. That's probably good in terms of that. Or, maybe again, that's showing a source of wealth. So the aspects to the second house ruler, the positive aspects are going to show positive ways that you gain income or gain profit, whether it's separating or applying. However, since natal is sort of taken as the be-all of astrology, modern natal astrology is kind of used for everything for modern astrology, there isn't a recognition of the difference between separating and applying. So as I was saying, someone looks at a chart, they see this, supposedly wonderful Jupiter talisman, but they're like, oh, look, there's an opposition of Saturn. It's a separating opposition, not a problem, okay? And that's just, and if you haven't done horary, if you're not, using traditional, Renaissance, medieval, electional astrology, then you're going to get confused about that. But if you're doing horary, there really is a huge difference in electional as well. There's a huge difference in applying and separating aspects. An applying aspect shows current events or future events. It's effective in getting things done. A separating aspect shows the past or shows things that are ineffective unless you're trying to get rid of something. Okay, so huge difference between applying and separating aspects. This also brings up another issue, which is the quote out of sign aspects. And I get, again, a lot of people come to me and they're like, out of sign aspects. What you've got is, as I was saying, there's this transition where you've got sign to sign aspects in Hellenistic, and then you've got this move to using increasing numbers of degree aspects. So the kind of mixed level is an out of sign aspect. So you're doing the aspect by degree, but if it wouldn't otherwise be an aspect by sign, it's not considered to be an aspect. So, again, the logic of those, so sign to sign is if they're in the sign, if they're two signs away, it's a sextile, no matter where they are in the sign, that's sign to sign. But aspect by degree only, you're not looking at the sign, you're only looking at the degree distance apart. So again, sign to sign is not an aspect. So you only have a problem with sign to sign aspects if you're working with a hybrid, where you're mixing those systems together. And Lilly has that. He talks about, for example, something not a planet 9 being combust if it's not in the same sign as the sun. Well, again, to me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you're close enough to the sun to be combust within 8.5 degrees, to me, it doesn't really logically make any difference. You're in a different sign. How does that protect you from the combustion? The logic there, I don't get it. I'm very much a degree aspect person. So the sign, out of sign aspect stuff, it doesn't really come into my consideration. I don't worry about it. And what I would say about it, and when you're talking about a horary, is that if before the aspect is perfected, that the planets change sign, what I do is look at that in terms of if there's a change in essential dignity. So if, for example, you're talking about the ruler of the first, which is the significant of the querent, goes from, say, being in sign to being peregrine, or goes from being in sign to being afflicted in essential dignities, like, say, going into detriment, then that's showing a change in the situation or attitude of the signified person or thing. For example, if it's second house ruler and you're going to conjoin it, but they're going to change signs before the conjunction takes place. And again, it goes from being afflicted in essential dignity to being, say, dignified by sign or exaltation. Then it's sort of like, again, if second house, you could say, well, it looks like you're not going to have the money or the money's going to be a problem, but all of a sudden it's going to improve. So I don't see it as, oh, it wipes out the aspect, but I see it that it gives very useful information if it's in the change as far as giving additional nuance and complexity to the delineation. So again, that's my approach. I mean, if you want to take an approach of like, okay, I'm going to ignore it, I'm going to wipe it out, that's your preference if that works for you. Always remembering that these are not objectively true. That the technique that you're using has an underlying logic, but there's always alternatives to it. So I just wanted to put that out there because one of the biggest problems is this idea of astrology, that there's some, and again, it's all split up in different schools. And when people say astrology, what they mean is modern astrology. And then what they're talking about is modern natal astrology. And that has its own set of techniques, has its own set of assumptions, and its own set of preferences. And it's perfectly reasonable to be operating in a different school with different assumptions and preferences. The most important thing is to be aware of what you're doing and to be respectful of other people's techniques and preferences, and recognizing that you can come up with extremely accurate predictive results in all the different schools: modern, Vedic, Hellenistic, medieval Renaissance, and that there's lots of valid variations in it. So I just thought I would put that out there. I think it's interesting, like I said, to understand the use of aspects, to understand the alternatives that are possible with it. It's like I said, a little confusing for people to look at the stuff that I do because I'm doing stuff that's different from what everybody else does in terms of modern, and even perhaps other people doing what they're saying they're doing medieval Renaissance. So I hope you find it interesting. And as always, it's very useful to delve into technique and to recognize that the technique needs to serve the intuition of the astrologer. That when we're doing a medieval Renaissance delineation, what we're doing is using our intuition within the confines of the chart, within that confines of the technique. The technique serves the intuition. The intuition is not just running out and doing it by itself. At the same time, it's not separate from the technique. It's important as well. So good. I hope you enjoy that, and hope you enjoy delving further into medieval Renaissance astrology.